competitions, we need to export our photos exactly to a certain size, resolution, or maybe you want to send them through email and they're too large and we want to get them to the right size. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. So let's talk about what this thing, the reality myth. So, how many people have gone in, and it doesn't matter if it's now or when you first started shooting photos, and took a photo, brought it into Lightroom or looked at it on your phone in the camera app and went in to edit it, and you started moving around sliders and you're like, oh, this looks pretty cool. And then you move another slider and another slider, and then you get to a place where you're like, wow, I destroyed this photo. Like I know that happened to me a lot, definitely before I started post-processing, but even now, there's times when I do it to myself. So I think that there's a couple things about post-processing that come to mind when photographers think about it. Now, if you're a purist, you think about film, there comes into question this idea of what is reality, right? When you used to shoot film, you could trust what was on the film. Nowadays, there's all these things like AI, sky replacements, all these different things. And I think that post-processing has gotten kind of a negative connotation. I even think, I see more now when I go through Instagram, photographers, really, really talented photographers that will take an awesome photo, they'll post it, but then right after that photo, they'll take a video of the scene, just so you know that it's a real photo. And that seems kind of unfair that the photographers that aren't using AI have to prove that they're not using AI, versus the folks that use AI and don't say it, right? That's where there's a little bit of disingenuousness. So I want to step away from the AI stuff. I want to step away from the remove tools in Photoshop. Many of us use them, and that's a line where everybody has to decide for themselves where they're comfortable with. But I don't want that to be part of our conversation tonight. So the reality myth is this. When we think about film photos, we think that we're looking at reality. And I would argue that that's not true, right? There's a lot of choices that are made when you're taking a photo. You can disguise stuff in the shadows. When you're shooting a certain film stock, you're getting different color renderings, you're getting different sharpness with lenses, with your camera, the way you process it in the dark room. All of these things have an effect on how a photo looks and feels. So in reality, if reality is what we see, if that's what we're considering reality, film definitely had an impact on photos. I would argue that now, with the technology that we have, if used in a way that if we want to use it in this way, we can get closer to reality than we've ever gotten before with photos. So that's the argument that I would like to put out there. I think this conversation usually goes the opposite way, and we talk about all the manipulation that happens in photos. And when someone says, oh, that photo is photoshopped, there's this connotation like it's a fake photo. But that's not true, because almost everybody in this room uses Photoshop to some degree to process their photos. And we're not all going into, I mean, if that's your intent, if your intent is to make an AI photo, absolutely you should do it. You should be proud of it. It's definitely a form of art. It moves away from the realm of photography. But if your goal is to capture what it is that you're seeing, we can get closer to that than we've ever been able to get before. So I think that's an important thing to throw out there before we move forward. Now I'm going to throw this out to the room. If there is a brave volunteer who'd like to try and explain what a raw photo is, what a JPEG photo is, one or the other. Any volunteers? I can wait on that.
I nominate Laszlo.
No, I mean, it's just that JPEG is kind of like a shortened version of the RAW. You know, they take out some of the unimportant details and they turn it a smaller file format.
Just has less pixels, right? It doesn't retain as much information.
Less pixels and condense some pixels and stuff like it, but I don't really know, I mean, how the RAW processor, I mean, I know how it works, you know, by the cores and all the things, but I don't know the proper definition of it, you know.
No, but you're definitely onto something. JPEGs are definitely compressed files, and raw files are not. Jeff?
Yeah, raw, the term that comes to mind, it's like a digital negative.
That's
In other words,
a really good way to think about it.
that it's sort of the base from which you can work and manipulate to whatever degree you wish, and JPEG is sort of formulated. It's sort of, it's, I guess it's a form of AI that they
No, it's a
pick a
developed
certain.
raw.
They
It's a
pick a certain.
developed raw in a way of shortening the original, potentially total,
Yeah.
file.
I mean, your every single thing that all three of you said is accurate. A JPEG is a compressed file, which means that it's smaller. A raw image is uncompressed.
Well, I actually thought that they chose raw because it's an acronym on something, but also because it's raw as it is, not not manipulated in any
Yes.
way.
100%. So I'm gonna pull up a list.
I just have one more point.
Go ahead.
I also, that when you open and close a JPEG, I always thought you lost some pixels. In other
No,
words,
no.
every
No,
time
no,
you
no.
open and close it.
No, it's only if you resave it.
Well, okay, resave it.
Yeah, if you make changes to a JPEG
Yeah, that's what
and
I
then you
mean.
save it as a
Yeah.
new file,
Right.
there's a potential for that file to get smaller or larger, depending on what the changes are. But
It's not degrading though.
Yeah, degraded.
it can definitely degrade, especially if you do it a lot.
Okay.
Like if you open up a JPEG 100 times and save it out over and over and over again, and it keeps going through a process of compressing the file, then it can definitely get degraded.
Okay.
And if you change the size of the image, especially, let's say you upscale the image, make it larger, 100% it's degraded. So I think this idea of a raw file being a negative is a pretty good place to start. But it's a little bit different because when we go out to try and shoot raw files, and actually let's take a step back for 1 second. Just for anybody that's not totally sure what we're even talking about, our cameras can shoot, most of our digital cameras or even older cameras can shoot JPEG files, or they can shoot raw files, or they can shoot both. So you go in and you tell your camera what you want it to shoot. For somebody that would like to get into post-processing or shoots a certain kind of photo, but then also goes and takes pictures of their kids, it's probably a good idea to shoot both, because you may not want to spend the time on every single photo you take processing it. Because here's the thing with JPEGs, right? When you shoot a JPEG, your camera's doing a number of things. Yes, it's compressing the file, but it's also taking the white balance that you shot that photo at, and it's building it into the file. It's taking the color space, it's building it into the file. So it's even going through a process of adding or removing contrast depending on the image. When you look through your digital camera and you look through the electronic viewfinder or you look on the LCD screen, you're actually seeing a JPEG rendering of what your camera's seeing. So you may notice that when you take a photo and you're taking a raw photo, what you saw or what you remembered seeing on the back of your camera is not the same thing you see when you load it up on your computer. Okay? So the advantages are, if you have no interest in spending time on the computer at all, you don't want to do any post-processing whatsoever, which is totally fine. You can still take amazing photos that are JPEGs. JPEG is a good option for you. It's going to make your file sizes smaller, so it's going to take up less space in your computer. You'll be able to share it really easily because almost any computer program can read a JPEG, where that's not necessarily true for a raw file, right? You can choose compression, which is okay, whatever. That essentially means that if you know that you're shooting for the web, you don't need to have big files, you can shoot that way. I wouldn't recommend it because you never know what you're gonna do with your photos later on. I would always recommend shooting at the highest quality you possibly can. But so those are some of the advantages of a JPEG. But when we talk about raw files, these aren't files that you can just share with anybody. You can't just load it up in any program. You can't send a text message to someone with a raw file and hope that they'll be able to open it up. So there's things that need to happen with this raw file before they're ready to share. And when you shoot raw files, you're not shooting them to take a great photo. You're shooting them to get the best exposure you possibly can and the most amount of information in that file, so that when you get it back to process it in a raw processor like Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw, you have all the data you need to make that photo the best that it possibly can be. That's really the point of it. So you're getting a ton more colors, you're going from like 8 billion colors to I think something like 70 billion colors with a raw file. You have a wider color gamut. So you have control, really, really nice control over the finer details like shadows. You can recover shadows in a really big way, and we'll go deeper into that. So the question that we really need to ask ourselves is, what is our goal here? For me, what I've come to realize through my own experience, and I know where I stand on it, I only shoot raw files. Because when I go out to take a picture, I'm trying to make pictures that are portfolio worthy for me, something that I could sell to someone, something that represents my abilities as a photographer. So raw files allow me the ability to make decisions on how my photos look versus allowing my camera to make those decisions for me. Because once you get your photos into Lightroom, if it's a JPEG, your ability to edit that photo is drastically reduced. And things that were made, decisions that were made by either your camera or by you when you were shooting are now baked into your file. So, this is the real question that people should be asking themselves. Should I shoot raw? Is it worth it to you? Are you someone that wants to learn how to post-process? Are you someone that, when you look at your photos, and then you look at somebody else's photos, a professional photographer, you say, I think I can get better photos. Why are my photos not as good as this? If you're someone that's asking yourself questions like that, then you should probably consider shooting raw photos and learning how to post-process. If you don't, if you're happy with your photos, the only person that needs to be happy with your photos is you. If your goal is to just go out and take photos and enjoy them, and you're happy where they are, then you should be shooting JPEG. You shouldn't even waste your time thinking about raw versus JPEG or post-processing if that has no interest to you whatsoever. For me, the answer is definitely, I shoot raw because I want to have control over my photos. I want to have the highest quality photos, and I want to be able to print them out and get the most out of those photos. So yes, I shoot raw, and therefore, because I shoot raw, post-processing is very important. You will almost never see a photographer's raw files. It's not something that's there to show, right? They actually can make you feel like you're a terrible photographer when you first load them up to your computer. And I'm gonna show you some of my raw files, and you can see exactly what I mean. But another thing that I want to point out on this slide is this photo was not taken on an expensive mirrorless camera. This photo was actually taken on an iPhone, and I know there's a lot of people in our club that only shoot photos on their phone. And I just want to make it really clear that there are things that are lost. You're not getting as large files, so in terms of printing size and all of that, you're not going to have the same kind of resolution. But we do have the ability now, especially on iPhone, and I know that there's apps on Android that will allow you to do this as well, to shoot raw photos on your phone. So you don't need to purchase an expensive camera to be able to play around with this. This photo was actually shot on my iPhone because when I got to the location, I was running around, and this is 2 doors down from my house, and everybody probably knows this bridge. I went there because I had contractors at my house, brought my camera bag just in case I wanted to shoot. They got out, and the sky was looking really beautiful, so I ran over there with my camera, pulled my camera out of my bag, and I didn't have an SD card in it. So I couldn't shoot it with my camera. So I was like, what the hell, I'll shoot it with my iPhone. I had never, and I worked for Apple for 15 years, have never shot a raw file on my camera, on my iPhone up until this point. I was like, let me give it a try. And I was actually really, really amazed how well I was able to process the raw files that came out of an iPhone. So you are not limited to just the tool that you have and spending a lot of money on a camera.
On that photo,
Yes.
you've got JPEG on the left and RAW on the right.
This is actually, I did not shoot a JPEG. This is a not processed raw photo, and this is a processed raw photo. So neither are JPEG.
Neither are JPEG.
Nope. Actually, they're both JPEGs, but they were because I exported them as JPEGs. But yes, and when you're looking at it now, the left is straight out of camera raw photo. The right is the processed version of the photo.
And can you tell us what you did to get from left to right?
Yeah, Yeah, I can, and we're gonna go through examples so that you see what my workflow looks like. But I also think that it's important that everybody understands when it comes to post-processing, everybody does it differently. Everybody forms a style for how they like to post-process, and nothing is right or wrong as long as you're getting to the result that you look to get to, okay? There's a lot of tools, there's a lot of programs, and I don't think that we need to get confused by which one's the right one. We just figure out what works for us. And you'll go on YouTube and you'll watch tutorials on post-processing by a lot of different photographers, and they'll almost contradict each other. And yet at the end, they all end up with beautiful photos, okay? So I will show you as we dive deeper into some of these examples, what my workflow looks like and some of the things that I think about, but that doesn't mean that's the way that you're gonna post-process. If you look at my photos or Laszlo's photos, completely different. And the way that we post-process is completely different. And I think Laszlo's photos are amazing. So, everybody should know what this looks like to some degree. What's this?
Exposure.
Exposure correction.
Yes, this is the light meter on a camera. So if you shoot a photo on a digital camera, for anybody who hasn't done it, this is down on the bottom of your screen usually. It's a meter on your camera that tells you when it thinks that you're at the right exposure. So if you're shooting it automatic on your digital camera, it will always move your settings so that the camera gets right into 0, which should be ideally the perfect exposure. This is flawed though, and I'm going to talk about why in just a second. There's another tool that I like to use a lot when I'm shooting my photos and when I'm processing my photos to really give me a better idea of dynamic range. So everybody understands if I was underexposing a photo, this little black line would move over this way and I'd see it here. And I can make decisions from that as to what I want to change in my settings to get me back to 0. Other side, I'm overexposing my photos. I would argue that even though this looks more complicated, this is a histogram, it really is not. We have the option to turn this on in our cameras so that we can see it when we look at our LCD screen on the back of our camera. Essentially what's happening here is our camera is looking at the entire scene and letting us know what the dynamic range is across the entire scene. So forget about all these colors because that's just something that you're gonna see in Lightroom when you're talking about color. I'm simply talking about exposure. So all the way over on this side are my blacks, all the way over on the other side are my whites, I have my shadows, my midtones, and I move up that way. So if I'm underexposing a photo and I'm clipping my blacks, which means I'm getting no data whatsoever, pure black, I'll see a line. This will move up over here and I'll show you some of them in just a second. And the same thing is true on the other side. So if I'm overexposing my highlights and I'm getting pure white and no detail there whatsoever, this will stack up against that side. So take a look at that. Here's some examples. So I have a clipping indicator up here in the top corner. So there's parts of my image that have no detail whatsoever in the shadows. The center one is a well-exposed photo, ideal exposure. You're not gonna see that very often. And then the one all the way to the right for you guys, is an overexposed photo. So back in the day of film, there was times when certain film stocks would tell you to actually overexpose a little bit so that you get a proper exposure. I would argue nowadays that the opposite is true for digital cameras. That if you overexpose and clip your highlights, you will not be able to recover them. That's not a mistake that you want to make. But if you clip a little bit on your shadows end, shadows are much more recoverable, especially if you're shooting raw files. So my question that I'm going to throw out to the group is this. This is a histogram of photo. This is the light meter for that photo, and this is why it's flawed. It's telling me that I have the perfect exposure. However, both my highlights and my shadows are clipping. This is not rare. This happens all the time. If you shoot landscape photography, or if you go outside and you see a beautiful sunset, and you say, I want to take a picture of that, this will be your histogram. You may not know it because you're not looking at it, and your camera will tell you that you have the right exposure, but chances are your sky will look very, very white, You won't see the detail in the color, and everything in your foreground is going to be completely black, silhouetted. So what would you do in this scenario? If you were in this scenario looking at this histogram, what do you think the right choice is?
Few shots.
I would slightly underexpose it.
So both of your answers are right. You said take multiple shots, right? So you can create an HDR by taking multiple shots at different exposures, one where you're underexposing and one where you're overexposing, and then you can combine those photos really, really easily in Lightroom. It's an automatic process. You don't really need to do much work. The other thing that you can do, if the dynamic range isn't too crazy, is you can underexpose the photo slightly, right? If you can get to a place where you're not clipping your highlights, but you're a little bit under on your shadows, and you're shooting raw, you can do a lot of recovery. Our cameras have a lot of room for pulling up those shadows and giving us details. So I want to go through 2 examples now where we explore something like this. This is not my photo, so I will say that. This is a photo from a friend and a wedding photographer. And when you're at a wedding, you're running around, you're doing a lot of crazy stuff. You usually have 2 cameras on you. You may be in one location that has one sort of lighting, and then another location that has completely different lighting. That was the case here. So this looks black. It almost looks like there's nothing there, especially on the projector, but that's a photo, right? That's a really, really underexposed raw photo. Now, if you look at the right side, the top one is a JPEG, and the bottom one is a raw file. And essentially all that was done to this photo was just recovering the shadows, meaning bringing up the shadows to make this a brighter photo. Look at, which is amazing that you can even get that much out of a JPEG from this photo because it's so terrible, but look at the shadows here in the JPEG.
Yeah.
You're losing all that detail. It just goes to gray. There's nothing there, right? Even in the guy's hair, his suit, there's contrast that's lost that can't be regained because we shot it in JPEG and it just doesn't have the ability to recover shadows in the same kind of way. Versus the bottom, which is a raw file, same photo, same file, and they recover the shadows and it looks like a flawless image, right? Maybe there's some noise in those shadows if we took a closer look, and we can resolve that with some noise reduction. But clearly, there's a big difference between how you can process a raw photo. Here's a different photo, and I just want to tell you a little bit of a story, a little backstory here. These are actually my photos. So that's the final image on the right-hand side. I exposed 2 pictures for this image. When I went out to take the photo at night, I had an idea in my mind of what I wanted, right? I knew the composition that I wanted because it was pitch black. There was no way I was going to find the composition that I wanted. So I had been to this place multiple times. This is Catterscale Falls in New York. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to get as much detail as possible in the foreground area. So what that meant was, in order for me to do that, I had to shoot a little bit, stop down on my aperture from wide open because I wanted it to be sharp and detailed. But I had to keep my shutter open for a really long time because there was 0 light in the scene. Okay, so for this photo, which is this one here, I kept my shutter open for 5 minutes. I stood there for 5 minutes while my camera was exposing a photo. The only problem with this is keeping my shutter open for 5 minutes, stars move. They are not still. So if you take a photo of stars for 5 minutes, they just turn into trails. They don't look like stars anymore. So I knew this before I started taking my photo. So I knew that I also needed an exposure that would be appropriate for the stars. So that one was shot at 20 seconds so that I got sharp. I don't know if you can really see it on the projector, but I got sharp stars, but my foreground is a lot darker. This would probably have a ton of noise had I gone in and tried to just bring up the shadows there. So by shooting this, I was able to pull out a lot of detail in the shadows with a 5-minute exposure because I shot it in RAW. Had I shot it in JPEG, this photo probably wouldn't have been possible, or I wouldn't have been able to execute it in the way that I did. Additionally, because the white balance that was automatic on my camera was looking pretty warm, because I shot it RAW, I was able to bring it back, cool it down, the way that it should be at night. At night, things are generally bluer. Once our eyes adjust to it, we see blue. And for the photo, it was really cold, so, and it's icy, I wanted to have the feeling of it feeling a little bit that way as well. So the raw file really allowed me to go in and get a ton of detail. This is super zoomed in on that file, and it's really, really clean. I know you can't really tell with the projector because it's kind of patchy, but the shadows are really clean. There's a lot of detail in there, and I can only do that because I shot this file.
There's graffiti everywhere.
So,
What's that?
So there's graffiti everywhere.
so how did you combine the two pictures to get the third picture, the final picture?
So for something like that, which is a fairly complicated process, well beyond where we're gonna go today, that's something that I would do in Photoshop. So Photoshop, I have the ability to align those two files. Literally, they were taken 5 minutes apart because it was a 5-minute exposure. So I can align those two files. I can just tell the computer to do it. It looks at the two files, it analyzes them, and it says, this is how they line up together, okay? So now they're stacked on top of each other.
Right.
So all I need to do is put a mask over one of those photos and just show the part that I wanted to show. So if it was the sky, I would select the sky and just make that visible through the mask and hide everything else.
Do you use any kind of flashlight or something to paint to pop more the
I have
waterfall?
before. I don't like it though because it doesn't look natural to me. So it's cool. I think that light painting is really interesting, and it's almost a different genre of photography. If there's a light that's introduced, you know, because there's an unnatural light from a bridge or something like that, that's cool. Like that's there, and that's what it should be. But I don't like going and lighting up parts of the landscape. This is just me. This is a personal decision. I don't like going to light up parts of the landscape that are naturally lit. It just doesn't. Me, I know that it wasn't there, so it feels weird. And if you have the ability to take a long enough exposure to get enough light to capture the detail, I'd rather do the blend than do light painting. That's just a personal choice. Okay, so we're gonna go into Lightroom, but I wanna make a couple points here. One, Lightroom is 100% built off of Adobe Camera Raw, which is part of Photoshop. So Photoshop existed before Lightroom. Adobe Camera Raw was part of Photoshop. This is the way that Photoshop allows you to process raw files, okay? When Lightroom was created, it was created with photographers in mind that didn't need all the extra bells and whistles that are in Photoshop. So they created a standalone, but essentially they're exactly the same app. If anybody's used Adobe Bridge before, that's essentially like a cataloging app that you can use to go into Photoshop. That part is also built into Lightroom. So Lightroom is kind of this self-contained photography raw processor. Photoshop has all that and so much more. So we're gonna talk strictly about Adobe Lightroom and Camera Raw because they're the same, but almost any raw editor out there, you're going to find almost identical features, okay? So with that being said, let's jump into Lightroom. So I have 3 photos here. I have the raw file and I have the processed file, and we will spend some time going through each photo talking about the features that are there. So this first photo, which is from Great Falls, let me clear some of this stuff up so we can see a little bit better. Go away. There we go. Okay, so this looks like garbage. This is not a good photo, all right? It's super dark, and I know things are lost with the projector, but I can tell you that it's a super dark photo. It almost looks like there's no detail whatsoever. A lot of the features and the things that drew me to this photo are completely lost and looking at this raw photo. I want to point out the histogram, which is up in the top right corner. I protected my highlights, so I didn't blow out anything there. And there's just a slight bit of clipping in the shadows. So this is actually exposed really well, from my opinion, but it doesn't look good. And that's kind of the point here, is this is where we can start, and this is where we can get very discouraged. We can go out and shoot a bunch of photos and have a great time doing it and feel like we really captured something special. Then we can get it back and put it on our computers, and say, what was I thinking? That is not a good photo. I would never show anybody this. This is not presentable to me. But with a little bit of work, I was able to take this photo and process it and get to this place where now a lot more detail is brought out. The crop that I wanted to do is there. I can see into the shadows of the rocks, which my eyes could certainly do, but my camera was not doing. So I spent a lot of time working on this photo, and even look at the sky. There's detail in the clouds. That was there when I was there, and I knew there was detail in the clouds, but when I go back to the raw photo, there's no details in it, right? So let's dive into this photo a little bit. And I know this may be hard, but I'm gonna ask, can you guys see what's written over there? I know it's probably somewhat small, but I wanna make sure that everybody
Jack,
can somewhat tell what I'm
maybe
doing.
if you kill some of those lights,
Yeah.
you'll be able to see what's on the screen a little bit better.
Oh, it's probably, That's one.
How
I'm just gonna try them out.
about back there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the layout of Lightroom before we even look at the features. I'll start with this navigator over here. So this is a way that you can sort your files, add them into collections. You can view your entire library from over here. I'm not interested in going through that, but what I am interested in is this very top corner up here. This is a little bit small, but I'll tell you what it says. So the first box that I click on gives me the option to fit or fill. So I can fill the frame with my photo, or I can fit it to the area that I have viewable. So a lot of people will get lost in Lightroom instantaneously. As soon as they zoom in on their photo, it's very difficult to navigate. So this is a really easy way to get back to looking at a full screen version of your photo. You also have a little bit more granular detail where you can choose to go in at 100%, or you can choose specified percentages that they lay out for you here. So you can go in really, really tight if you wanted to. Just wanted to point that out. Not a major thing, but I think it's important because navigating your photo can be really challenging if you get zoomed in and you don't know where to go from there. We're gonna move over to the right side of the screen where I already pointed out we have our histogram here. And then underneath our histogram, we actually have data from our photo. So it knows what millimeters, what aperture we shot at, what our ISO was, and what our shutter speed was. That can always be helpful. And then underneath that, we have a couple of different icons. We're gonna mainly talk about the basic panel. We'll go into the crop panel a little bit, but where I spend the majority of my time is the mask panel here, which is this circle with the dots around it. So before we move into any of that, let's stay with the basic panel here, and let's talk about some of the features that are in here. So since we shot a raw file, we have the ability to completely adjust the temperature, so our white balance. So I can make it really blue, which looks terrible. I can make it really yellow, which also looks terrible. We can go with a really green tint or a purple tint. What I will tell you is subtlety is king here when it comes to white balance. We also have this little eyedropper that can help us get to the right white balance. So if we select that eyedropper and we go and find something that's neutral, like a white or a gray or a black, then it will dial in what it thinks the right white balance is. That doesn't mean that's where we're gonna end, but that does give us a good starting point. I usually don't touch white balance until after I make a lot of more changes, because as we reduce and add contrast, our colors change as well. So I generally leave colors toward the end. We have an exposure dial, which is obvious, makes it brighter and darker. We have contrast, which when we increase it, makes our darks darker and our brights brighter. And obviously if we go the other way with it, our shadows and highlights come together more. We have simply our highlights, which is the brightest tones that we can affect by itself. We have the shadows, which are our darkest tones that it can affect by itself. And then we have whites and blacks. Does anybody have any idea what the difference between whites and highlights are?
Whites are throughout the entire photo.
I would say highlights are your brightest of your whites.
Okay. Yeah, so when we're talking about whites, we're actually talking about our white point and our black point, which is the brightest that our highlights can go. And our blacks which is the blackest that our blacks can go. So you're really setting a white point throughout your entire image. So one thing that I like to do is keep everything in my histogram, so I'm not clipping anywhere, and whites and blacks can be really helpful for that, but I generally won't start there. We'll come back to that as we start processing the photo. Now there's a couple more things in the basic panel that I want to discuss because they can be confusing. There is this area called presence, and there's three features in here. One's called texture, one's called clarity, and one's called dehaze. These are all forms of contrast. They're something called micro contrast, and they work on very specific things. So something like texture is pretty much what it sounds like. If you have really small detail, such as grains of sand, or you're looking at a leaf on a plant and you want to get the minimal details sharpened, texture is a great way to go in and sharpen some of those. So let me zoom in here a little bit. It might not be that obvious on the projector, but look at the rocks right here and watch what happens as I increase the texture. You see that? A whole lot more clarity comes into those. So when you're working on really fine detail, that's a good place to start. Clarity works on details that are a little bit larger, and it looks for areas of contrast, so lines that are a dark shadow being cut through a highlight, and it works on those areas more. So you actually see a boost in vibrance, or you get some more highlight action coming up when you start using clarity. Clarity can be really good at helping things stand out, but things that don't necessarily have that fine detail. So those two things can be used together or by themselves. And the one thing that I would caution about that and dehaze is just to be careful with them, because very quickly you can get to a place where things start looking fake and not really where you want to go. But I do use them a lot. Dehaze is exactly what it sounds like as well. You may be shooting off in the distance on some mountains, and there's haze there, so it's a very the photo lacks a lot of contrast. Dehaze can go in and clear a lot of that up. Or if something's really sharp, or we want to add a little bit of atmosphere, if we go the opposite way with dehaze, we can actually add a little bit of atmosphere.
What's the difference between clarity and contrast?
So contrast is working on all highlights and shadows of the entire photo, whereas clarity is really looking at specifically the edges of things. So right here, where my rock meets the water, there's a sharp edge there and a big difference in contrast between the dark rock and so it hones in specifically on, a lot like sharpening can do, specifically on those edges, where contrast is just totally affecting every shadow and highlight indiscriminately. So it's kind of like a smarter contrast in a way. We have vibrance and we have saturation, which sound very similar as well. And what I would say about saturation is it's affecting all colors equally. So when I bring up my saturation, everything is getting very saturated or unsaturated, black and white. When I'm talking about vibrance, vibrance is actually pretty smart. It looks to bring up more dull, so it knows what's the most, the brightest colors or the richest colors, and it looks for the more dull colors and tries to bring them up first before it impacts other areas of saturation. So this is actually used a lot in portrait photography because it's really good for skin tones. It won't oversaturate in the same way that saturation will. I will say that I use vibrance 95% of the time over saturation when I'm trying to add color back to my photos. So that's more or less the basic panel here. And this shouldn't be new to anybody, because if you go in to edit a photo in your iPhone or your Android phone, you're gonna see almost all of these settings as well. Now the problem with these settings is that when you make changes to any of these things, you're affecting your entire photo. You're not choosing the areas that you want to impact and then the other areas are left alone. That's not what's happening here. We're affecting every single part. So we may get these rocks in the foreground to look really good by lifting up our shadows all the way, but then we're losing a lot of the contrast in the background that we would like to have. So the way that we can work around this is through using masks. And masks are really to me, the biggest feature in Lightroom that will help us get to a place where our photos can get, can be showed to other people and look really good. Let's get this photo to a place where it's somewhat presentable and we can start talking about masks a little bit. So I'm gonna bring my shadows up because they're really dark. I'm gonna bring some of my highlights down for the moment. Essentially what I do at the beginning of processing a photo is I look at it and I say, what are the problems and how can I start attacking them? So the first thing I do with any photo is I actually, yeah.
Between exposure and shadows, okay, the exposure, if you overexpose, you bring up the dark part of the whatever your subject is.
If I use exposure you're talking about?
Excuse me?
If I'm using the exposure slider?
Yeah, so in considering exposure, increasing exposure as having details in the dark side of the subject. Was why there is also a shadow that does the same thing.
So that's a really good question. Very much like how contrast affects all shadows and highlights, and very much how saturation affects every single color in your frame, exposure moves every single tone that's in your picture. So if I brought up the exposure here, I could get my shadows to a place that look really good, but my highlights also move, and then now my highlights are super overexposed, right? So I use shadows because if I look at my histogram, my highlights are actually in a pretty decent place, at least for starting. So I can know that I really only want to affect the darkest tones, and therefore shadows for me is the place that I would start. And as soon as I lift those shadows, consequently, my histogram is no longer clipping on the bottom end here. So I'm getting more detail in. Not even as much detail as I necessarily would want in these rocks, but enough. So I look at my photo and I say, what are the things that I don't like about it? For me, the shadows were really dark, there was no detail there. And I try and get my photo to a place where the dynamic range is actually shrunk down a little bit, so I can see all the details in my photo, and then I can add contrast where I want to add it. So I've lifted my shadows here. We're already in a place where I feel like we can start to see what's in this photo. My sky is not great, it's still really white. I can do a little bit of work on highlights here, but I also know that if I bring down the highlights to affect my sky, I'm affecting the waterfall and all of these cascades here in the foreground. So I want to be careful with that. I'll leave myself a little bit of room. That's where I bring my photo before I start moving into masking. So let's look at the masking panel. I'm going to go ahead and click on that. And there's a lot of options here. I have up at the top, select subject. Probably not going to help us in this image. I have select sky, select
Can you
background.
tell us a little bit what masking means?
Yes. So masking is us manually going in and selecting parts of our photo so that when if we want to just impact that one part of our photo, we can say, I only want shadows on these rocks in the foreground, right? I can go ahead and paint a mask over those rocks in the foreground, and I can lift my shadows just in that one place versus across my entire photo, okay?
So if you want to work the sky, you are masking the sky, you are masking the rest of it.
We can go either way with it. I'll show you, I'm gonna go through each one of these things, but just the general idea that it's pinpointing a very specific area of our photo and allows us to adjust settings just in that one area, okay? So select subject uses intelligence to look for a subject in your photo. If you were shooting wildlife, it would do a really good job of selecting that animal. If you were shooting a portrait, it would do a really good job of selecting that. In a landscape photo, you're not gonna get the best results most of the time unless they're really simple. We have select sky, which does its best to detect where the sky is and select that area. Select background, so if you did have a portrait and you wanted to impact just the background, you can select that. I'll go through all of these in a second. I just want to explain what's here first. We have select objects, which allows us to paint over an object and select that object. We have a brush, which allows us to free paint over whatever object it is that we're trying to mask. We have a linear gradient, which for anybody that was a film photographer or a photographer before post-processing became a really big thing, you may have seen these filters that people would put over their lenses some of those would be graduated, so it'd be a very dark filter at the top and slowly graduate down to clear filter. They would use that so that they can darken down the sky, but keep their foreground light. That's something that's built into Lightroom now. We have a gradient filter, which is a circle that'll allow us to draw a circle over things. And then we have range masks. We can either choose luminance, which is brightness, or darkness, or a certain color to make our selection. So let me show you what I mean. We'll start off with the sky here. I'm gonna do select sky just by clicking on it. It's gonna work a little while and it's gonna detect the sky, hopefully. Although it may not because we don't have internet. There we go. Okay, so now I have the sky selected, and what Lightroom does and what any other program would do that has this feature is it puts a red gradient over it so that I can see what it's selected. And it looks like it's done a fairly decent job. There's some areas in here by the trees that are a little bit lighter, so I may want to visit those later, or they may be fine. So the first thing is my sky was too bright. I wasn't getting any detail in those clouds. So I'm gonna start off with the highlights and I'm gonna bring those down and see what I'm able to recover. And I'm actually able to recover a pretty significant amount. It was a dark and stormy day, so there should be some detail there. Another thing that I like to do is add contrast to my sky. It helps bring the shadows down a little bit and the highlights up a little bit, which brings a little bit more detail there. And then what I also like to do is I'll look at my micro contrast, my texture clarity, and dehaze, and I will see what impact that has on my sky. It adds a little bit of definition and a little bit of darkness to my clouds, so I like that. I'm gonna leave that there, and I was able to now just affect the sky without affecting anything else. So if I hide that, my sky is gone, but nothing else changes, right? Something else that bothers me about this photo is that the blacks that are down here along.
Excuse me, what did you, I didn't see what you said, you hide, what did you?
Yeah, I was just hiding the mask so you can see it without
Oh, okay,
it.
that mask.
So the mask is gone, now it's back. The blacks that are in the rocks here are really, really dark to me still. I'm not seeing the detail of these rocks, and I know for sure when I was there, I was seeing a lot more detail. So I went in, I chose the plus sign, which gives me the same lists of different masks, and I'm using the brush tool so that I can free paint over these rocks. I'm gonna make it a little bit bigger. I'm gonna free paint over these rocks, especially the darkest spots, but I don't need to be super detailed in my selection here. And I'm gonna give these shadows a little bit more of a boost as well. So that's bringing out a little bit of detail. Bring my blacks up a little bit, maybe the black point's a little bit dark. Now I have a lot more detail in those rocks, and that looks a lot closer to what I remember seeing. Something that's happening here also is the top of the sky is looking really, really bright, and I don't want the eye to be brought there. So I'm gonna just bring a gradient tool in from the top, and I'm gonna very minimally darken down some of this top part, just so that my viewer's eye doesn't travel up through the waterfall and to the building, which is technically my main subject, and then get stuck up here in the brightest part of my image. Typically, people's eyes will gravitate towards the brightest part of your image, so generally your subject is the brightest part of the image, and you would love to have light on that subject. In this case, I had no light, it was very flat. So I want to just draw this linear gradient down from the top. But one thing that you'll notice is when I do that, I'm getting the impact of darkening down the top of the sky, but I'm also darkening down the trees over here a little bit. So one nifty tool that Lightroom has added in is we can actually combine masks. So if I go up to this top linear gradient, I see the part that I have selected, I can right click on it and I get a bunch of different options here. I can invert it, which would just do the opposite, or I can intersect it with another mask. So if I choose to intersect it with the select sky, all of a sudden, I am no longer selecting that part of the image where the trees are, and they aren't getting darkened down. So that's a really, really cool feature. Let's look at another photo here that we've gone through some of the tools, and we'll go through the process again. So this photo, again, has a lot of the same problems as the other image. I did underexpose this, and I remember when I was in the field, I was really thinking about the waterfall. So when you shoot waterfalls, which generally have really white water, in pretty dark areas like forest with a canopy, you can really easily overexpose your highlights in the waterfall. So I really wanted to protect that. I definitely went overboard here. I probably could have brought up my ISO a little bit, and still had a perfectly fine exposure. But because I shot this in RAW, I'm not concerned about the clipping of those shadows. So the first thing that I want to do here is I want to go into my basic panel, and I am going to, again, lift the shadows, bring back some more detail in the image, which has now flattened the image a little bit, but that's okay, because now I can see what I'm working with. The image looks really flat to me. So the tree that's in the foreground looks like it's on the same plane as the waterfall. They're just blending into each other. So one concept that I generally work into my workflow is building depth into my images. So when you look at something that's right in front of you versus something that's far away, the thing that's right in front of you has a lot more contrast. There's a lot deeper darks and brighter highlights in what's right in front of you. And as you go off into the distance, atmospheric perspective comes into play, and the things that are further away have less contrast. Your shadows are a little bit brighter. So I'm not sure how easily this is going to come through for you guys, but I'm going to try it anyway on the projector here. So I'm going to target my foreground with a linear gradient tool, and I'm going to focus on the immediate foreground here. Now the one issue that I'm going to have is there's this tree that's part of my foreground, and it's going directly up into my image, or directly up out of my filter, my mask. So I'm going to apply another mask within this. So I want to add to my linear gradient that I just had, and up in this little window here where I can go back and forth, I have a plus and a minus, and you know that we already did an intersect. So I'm going to add, and I'm going to say objects. I'm going to get my brush to about the right size of my tree, and I'm going to go up and I'm going to draw my tree. Lightroom now has detected the object that I was looking to focus on, and I selected the tree, and I have my foreground selected. So the way that I can introduce some more contrast here is I could either use the contrast slider. I can go pretty hard on that, but again, we know that's affecting every tone equally. I would like to bring out some more clarity so that it feels closer, and I would like to bring out a little bit of texture in this tree because there are some fine details there. So that's one part of it. I've now added some clarity and contrast to this foreground area. I'm going to darken this down a little bit too because this feels a bit distracting on the bottom. Another linear gradient. So now it's starting to feel a little bit better to me. And then what I'm going to do to deal with this background area is I'm going to use a brush. I'm going to come in and I'm going to paint this whole area really quick and rough. I'll get some of this over here too, and a little bit of this up here. Now I've come over my tree a little bit, so which is not really what I want to do. So I can do the opposite of what I just did, which is I can go to the subtract button, and I can say subtract objects, draw over my tree again, and it removes my tree. So now I can go in and I can remove contrast in the back. I can lift my shadows a bit, and I can even add a little bit of negative dehaze, which I'll go hard on it first so you can see what it's doing. It's really bringing in some atmosphere in there. And now I have a much more separated feeling. Now, of course, light would help a lot. If there was light in this background, I'd have a lot more separation from the tree. But that's done a lot of work to help me build some 3D effect into the image. So if I take it off, flat, now the tree feels really close and has a lot of texture, and the waterfall feels further away. Other thing that I want to do here, we can talk about the crop because I told you that we'd spend some time there. This is obvious because everybody has an idea of what cropping is. But in Lightroom specifically, there are a lot of different formats that we can shoot in, or that we can crop our image at. We can do a custom one if we want. We have to unlock this little lock to be able to do that. We can drag the tabs here however we want. I generally like to shoot in 4x5 format. Something about that just reminds me of film, and it just feels like an elegant format to me. So when I'm out in the field, I actually shoot my photos looking at a 4x5 crop. And because they're raw, that's not baked into it, so I can then go back and adjust that crop later on. But this is closer to how I shot it when I was in the field. I don't want that mess over there, and that helps to clean things up a little bit. If you have a horizon that is not straight, which happens quite often, there's a little tool here that we can use, and we can draw right along our horizon line, and it'll shift the photo to that horizon, which is really, really helpful. We also have the ability to do that manually by moving this slider. Really important, I think, for competitions especially, judges, the first thing that they'll point out is if your horizon is not straight. So it's a pretty easy thing to fix, and that's how I would do it. Okay, so this photo is looking better because I feel like now we have a little bit more of a 3D effect. I'm not gonna go much further on this one specifically, but I do think that there is a lack of saturation. These greens were definitely way more vibrant when I was there. And even the leaves, there was a lot more orange in those leaves in person. So I can go about it by first looking at vibrance, which looks pretty good to me. That's bringing to life those greens pretty well. Or I can reset that and you go with saturation. And that's doing a pretty good job too, as long as I'm staying in the realm of reality, right? So in this case, I don't think there's much of a difference one way or the other. I'm gonna go with vibrance because I don't want it to get oversaturated. But the one thing that I'm seeing here is as I'm bringing up either vibrance or saturation, the water is getting really, really blue. Can you guys see that?
So what the little triangle on top there?
That's my shadows. I'm clipping my blacks right now.
But why you click it? I don't understand that. Yeah.
So if I click it, it actually shows me, see the little blue areas in the
Yeah.
photo? Those are the areas that are peaking. Those are the areas where
okay.
there's lack of detail. If I unclick it, then I don't have to look at the indicator. It still shows that I'm clipping there, but an easy way to fix that is to go in and lift up my blacks. I would do it a different way. I would use the tone curve, but we're not gonna really get into the tone curve because that's just another way to add contrast. You can look deeper into that as you get comfortable with post-processing, but right now I'm good. My blacks are no longer clipping for Sergio. I'm gonna bring on my whites a little bit more so that I get a little bit more of that ambient light coming through. And this is pretty close to a finished image without me going much further on it. All right, well, anybody have, before we go on to the last and final photo, which is the hardest photo to process, and I'll show you why in a second, are there questions, anything that I can clear up on the things that we talked about in the first two photos?
Yeah, I don't know, you mentioned now the curves.
Yes. So tone curve is another form of adding contrast to your photo. So a lot of folks will go in and you may hear this from other photographers. They'll do something called an S curve, which is lowering your mid shadows so you get a little bit more detail there, or you get a little bit darkness there, and then lifting your, it doesn't work very well in this photo, and that's not something that I use, and you lift your shadows. This works very similarly to the histogram, where all the way over to the left are my shadows, and all the way over to the right are my highlights. And this is a way that you can dial in contrast in a more manual way. That's the way that I would put it. Whereas contrast is just across the board lifting your highlights and lowering your shadows. This allows you to dial in specifically how you want to do that. I generally don't use the tone curve, but the tone curve is a very popular tool amongst other photographers. I use it when I'm clipping in one place. I have the ability to just take my black point and lift that up really easily and get that out of clipping. So that's how I generally use it, but if you wanna look that up, on YouTube, there's tons of people that will talk to you about tone curves.
No, because I use the curves a lot.
Yeah,
The problem with the curve that I found is that it works, suddenly it goes out of range. So there is it's not too smooth, to me, in my hands.
yeah, no,
It
I
can
don't
be
like
very
it.
good and very bad at the
I don't like it
same-
either, it's very temperamental, like the smallest movements have pretty major impacts on it, which is why I generally don't use it, and I find the other contrast tools to be pretty effective. While I don't use contrast itself very much, I definitely use texture and clarity a lot. Any other questions before we look at the last photo? Yeah.
Really quickly, I
Yeah.
think you said, when you turned up the vibrance, you got too much blue in the waterfall.
Yes.
So would you just highlight the waterfall and then reduce vibrancy, or what's the way you?
Yeah, so there's one way that, there's a couple ways that we can do this. Let me go in, I'm gonna,
Which was the question? I
the
didn't-
question was, when I brought up the saturation on the whole photo, the waterfall got, or the water under the waterfall and the waterfall itself got fairly blue, bluer than I remember it being. So how would I go and counteract that? There's a couple ways that you can do it. One is I can go in here with a brush and I can paint that water and the waterfall area, and I can reduce saturation there, which will just bring down overall saturation. There's nothing else there that's really saturated, so that will do the trick for me for sure. If it was more complicated, there's another area in the edit panel called the color mixer, where you can actually go in and really pinpoint specific colors. So there's a hue, so I could shift the hue of certain things. So if I wanted my greens to be more yellow, I can do that. There is saturation, so I can specifically target one color or another, and I can make that more saturated. So I'm doing the oranges right there, which is bringing up the leaves. So in this case, I could go in, there's nothing else in my photo that's blue, and I could just pull down the blue, and that would take the blue out of the water for me. So that you can do it in a couple different ways depending on how you're working with it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Saturation and vibrance.
Yes.
From what you said, I understand that you use one or the other, not both.
You can use them in combination for sure. If you look at your image and you say, nothing in my image is saturated enough, then saturation is a good place to start. But if you look at your image and you say, this yellow flower is really, really bright, but my greens seem really dull, that's where I would start with vibrance. Because vibrance targets the duller colors first and brings those up towards the higher, the color that's more saturated, so I can get my greens closer to that yellow flower. I would play with both of them, and you can definitely use them in combination. As I go up here and I bring up my saturation, I may notice that, you know, everything looks okay, the greens are good, but I wanna bring a little more saturation to the oranges. I can go in and then do that, and it'll bring some subtle vibrancy to the oranges as well. And then I can dial those back and forth. They can certainly be used in conjunction, and again, a little goes a long way here. You know, so you maybe part of your style to saturate your images a lot. It adds a little bit of a wow factor and appeal to it. For me, I'm trying to go for something pretty natural to what I saw. So you wanna be pretty soft-handed with both of these if that's what your approach is. But they can both be used in conjunction, for sure.
Yeah, I even a question that may be a little bit out of the photo, but if you want to have a more muted colors, which of the tools would you use in particular?
So do you wanna have more muted colors across the board?
Across the board, yeah, difficult to explain, but it's, yeah, across the board, but basically, you want, so what I do, I bring the gamma all on the left, down, of the entire thing, you know? And that reduces the contrast too,
Yep.
yeah, and my ideal would be muting, leaving the contrast in the same.
Leaving the contrast alone, but
Yeah,
bringing
yeah.
down the color.
How can you do that? There is any way to do that?
I mean, it depends on the exact look and feel that you're going for. If I use the vibrance or the contrast slider, but saturation in particular, I should not be affecting the contrast at all. So if I watch my darks and my highlights, as I bring down my saturation slider, I'm not affecting contrast. The tones, the histogram are staying exactly the same, no contrast change is happening. So if you wanted to have muted colors, which is certainly a style, then you can find where you're comfortable with using the saturation slider. If you're aiming to just desaturate certain colors, you can go in and you can target specific colors. Like if I don't want these greens to be saturated, I can bring those down, but everything else still has saturation. So you can be targeted about your approach, or you can just do all colors at once. If that answers your question. These saturation sliders do not affect contrast, but contrast definitely affects saturation. The more contrast you add, the more saturated your colors become. All right, I don't want to keep you guys too long, but let's look at this last image. So this is a pretty common occurrence when you're shooting a sunset. We talked about this. This is one of those circumstances where highlights are probably going to be blown, shadows are probably going to be blown, and you could make a couple different decisions here. I didn't make either one. I shot the proper exposure, and so I definitely clipped some of my highlights. We'll see if there's enough room to breathe here that I can recover those, because I shot this in RAW. I believe that there is. So let's just jump right into it. What are the problems with this photo right off the bat? Number one, there's zero detail in my sky, and I know this sky was super colorful, and my entire foreground is super dark, right? I could do what Laszlo had talked about earlier, which is shoot a couple exposures and have them combined so that I get all of that data. But in this circumstance, the water was coming in on me, and I had very little time on my tripod, and there was also about 60 people standing behind me. I got there very early, and this is a really, really popular spot in Acadia National Park. So I was rushing quite a bit and definitely made a mistake on this exposure. If I go ahead and start trying to level this photo out, I'm gonna start with my highlights here and bring those back. I actually can recover a fair amount here because I moved out of clipping very quickly, and you can see that there's a lot of detail in that sky. Let me play with my shadows a little bit to see what I can get out of this foreground. There's a decent amount of detail in that foreground as well. So I can really go pretty far with this photo. I'm gonna move relatively quickly through this photo in my normal post-processing, and I'll talk out loud as I'm doing it. I'm still clipping my blacks here, so I gotta keep that in mind. But I'm gonna move faster than I was in the other ones. So first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go in and I'm gonna select sky. I'm gonna see what I can bring out of this sky in terms of color. I'm gonna add some more contrast, which is also adding saturation. I am going to bring up my clarity a bit. That's darkening down my sky. The one thing that I don't like that's happening here is this band of orange along the horizon. It's starting to get too saturated for me. So I'm gonna go in and I'm actually gonna take a linear gradient and subtract off of my sky and soften it a little bit, coming up this way. Now that feels a little bit better to me. The other thing that I would like to do with my sky is I'd like to darken down the top of it a bit here. I'm gonna grab a linear gradient. I'm gonna bring that up to the top so it's pretty soft. I am going to bring down my exposure just a touch. I want it to be realistic, but I also want to emphasize the darkness there. And I am going to intersect that with the select sky so that I don't get all these trees up in the top end corner. Now I'm going to go in and I'm going to add my atmospheric perspective. So I'm going to add a bunch of contrast to what's happening in the immediate foreground here. I'm going to add some texture so that the texture in these rocks comes out. And then I am going to do the opposite back here. I'm going to grab a linear gradient tool. I'm going to select some of the rocks and the lighthouse in the back here. I am going to reduce my contrast a little bit. I'm going to lift my shadows. And I am going to add a slight amount of dehaze. But now everything that I just did on that is also affecting the sky. So I'm going to go to the minus button, and I'm going to select sky, and that's going to now remove that portion of the frame. Okay, so now I've done some work to push my lighthouse back. I've added detail to the immediate foreground rocks. Things are still feeling pretty dark in general in the foreground to me. So I'm gonna go back in and I'm gonna lift some of these shadows. That's bringing a lot more detail back in. But I don't like how bright this immediate area is here, because I don't want anybody's eyes getting stuck there. I'm gonna go ahead and bring down a little bit of exposure there.
Excuse me, so anytime you make a mask, it records the mask as a different layer, basically.
Essentially, yeah, and they're non-destructive, so here's my list of all the masks that I've made. I can channel through all of these, and I can click on them, so this is the very first one I did, the sky, and I can go back, and it has all of my settings saved. So if I wanted to dial something back or dial something up, I can always go back to it afterwards.
Can you tell me again, how do you add one mask to the other one
Yes.
selectively? How do you do
100%.
Yeah.
So let's do it. We'll do,
See the plus sign, Sergio, what's up?
let's do we'll do the sky one again, because that's, in this photo, that's the most obvious one. So what I wanna do is, I wanna darken just the top part of the sky, okay? Nothing else, just the top part of the sky. So I grab a linear gradient tool, and I come down from the top. But in my mask is also included now the lighthouse and all of these trees. So I have a plus and a minus button, which means that if I choose one of those, I'm either adding to the mask I already have, or I'm subtracting from the mask that I already have. The other option that I have is I can intersect with another mask. So intersect means only the parts where the two masks overlap does the mask exist. So right now, I have the top part of the sky selected, but not, the trees are also selected. I don't want those selected. So I'm not gonna do a subtraction of this, because it would be really hard to select all of this stuff. Instead, I'm going to do an intersect. So if I right click on the mask itself, I can intersect it with a select sky, which now leaves me with just the top part of the sky and not the trees at all. Does that make sense?
I'm a little dense, so I like the mask.
So Sergio, you see the plus sign at the top, every time you
Yeah,
hit the plus, that creates a new mask.
That creates a new mask.
Yeah.
So those are standalone masks.
No, it's
And then you
intersect-
have the list of the different masks.
Yeah, the intersected, I didn't understand exactly, so you have.
Okay, let's do one more then.
Yeah,
I'm
okay,
gonna
slowly,
delete,
so that I can,
I'm gonna delete this one, and I'm gonna do something different this time. I am going to do a color range mask. So I'm gonna go in, and I am going to select some sort of green here, which doesn't look like it's really selecting. But anyway, so I selected a green, and it's detecting green in almost all of this, right? But I don't want all of this as part of my mask. So instead, what I'm gonna do is I am going to intersect that mask. This time I will do it with a radial gradient. I can draw a circle around that area. Now, only where that circle is and that color together is the part that's selected. Does that make sense? So where the two things
well,
overlap.
I cannot say now that I didn't, because I looked terrible. So yes, I understood.
The concept makes sense. The process may not.
It's okay, I understood.
You could do the same thing with a brush, couldn't you, Jack?
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
So you could just make a brush and do it with a brush.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I could do a brush, and I can, let's say I wanted to just impact the bottom part of this sky, but I happen to be sloppy, and I painted over the entire portion of these rocks here, right? So you see where that is?
Mhm.
Let me make this, I'm gonna bring up my flow a little bit so that you can see a little bit clearer. Okay, so I've done a really bad job painting. All I wanted to paint was the bottom part of the sky, but I got all these rocks. So if I go in and I intersect that paintbrush with select sky, it is now, well, it did a fairly poor job because it still has the water selected here, but it did remove all of that trouble spots on the rocks. So that's how you can intersect. The adding and subtracting is also very useful as well.
What intersect means exactly?
It means where the two masks come together.
Oh, okay.
Okay? So, again, linear gradient from the top. I bring that down over the sky. It's covering the entire top portion of my frame, which I don't want. So I actually want the area where the two, this and select sky, come together and intersect with select sky. So now it's only selected the parts where they overlap. That make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So I will leave it there. I'll show you the finished versions that I had. I don't love this sky again, this orange down here, but these were the processed versions of these photos. So we got relatively close to where they were from where their counterpart raw files were. And yeah.
Question?
Any questions?
Well, I have a question about intersect. I didn't understand where. No. So just.
We'll have a private session.
Yeah, okay, oh, thank you.
Any questions?
Next Tuesday.
Next Tuesday, what?
Yeah, I have a question that's general. Oh, you were saying something?
I said next
No,
Tuesday.
Next Tuesday, you can ask the question.
Yeah, hold your questions till next Tuesday.
Next Tuesday.
You heard me pretty well. Better than last meeting.
I'm lost.
Never mind.
I'm
Did so
lost.
good, Sergio, until now.
Anybody but Sergio have any questions? Just joking.
If one is used,
Yeah, but I had a question.
Okay, I'll come back.
if one is used Photoshop,
Yes.
and you've developed a way of working with Photoshop,
Yep.
is there any point in investing the time in Lightroom?
No, I would say no. Let me show you something really quickly, since I have Lightroom open. So here is my raw file, the raw file with the changes that we made. I can jump right into Photoshop here. And I'll just show you that you can work in your process in Photoshop very easily, but if you find that the features of Lightroom could be helpful to you, you have them all available to you while you're in Photoshop. So, for instance, I have this file that I just brought in. I can go in Photoshop under Filter. I can go to Camera Raw. Camera Raw launches, and essentially I have Lightroom. So I can then lift my shadows, I can do my masking, and then I can save all that stuff, and I'm right back in Photoshop again. So if the stuff that you're doing in Photoshop does exactly what you want, and you don't need Camera Raw for any of it, you don't need the masking because you like using the brush in Photoshop, you like to make selections in Photoshop, you don't need to use it at all. Like I said, everybody post-processes differently, and there's no right or wrong when it comes down to it. The goal is, how do you get to the product that you want? What are the tools that are available to you? I like to have as many tools as I possibly can, and I don't use them on a lot of my photos. Like the one that I showed you of Catterskill, that was the dark sky one where I had to combine images. I couldn't do that in Lightroom if I wanted to. So knowing how to use that tool when I need it, that's what's helpful. So I think as long as you have the tools available to you that you need to get the most out of your photos, get them the way you want them, then I wouldn't change a thing about it.
Post-processing. Am I right that those two words mean, the post means after you press the button?
Yes.
And processing is whatever happens.
Whatever happens when you
After you press
get
the
it.
button.
Yes, yes. So technically a JPEG coming out of your camera is post-processed.
Already.
Because you're shooting the raw file, your camera's doing calculation, compressing, baking in your white balance and certain things, so it is processing your photo already.
Yeah, there was something before you were saying, I think it was not correct, somebody was not correct. When you, so the raw file is what basically the sensor feels. without any alteration.
All the data the sensor
Yeah,
pulls
okay,
in
so
without any
technically,
alteration.
hypothetically, if you have 3 different sensors, they should get the same image.
3 different
if the
sensors
sensor-
made by the same manufacturer, yeah.
Yeah, minutes.
Yeah.
Then, of course, the raw, which is already a transposition from the sensor, which is a physical thing, to the image, which
zeros
is a
and
plus
ones.
and zero and one.
Yeah.
You have various raw, Nikon makes a raw,
Yeah.
but they should be all the same because the purpose is to have the same image that comes out of the lens in some way.
Yeah.
The JPEG is a development of that one with the
Yes.
goal to get a very good image of reduced size.
Yep.
That's the thing.
Yep.
So there is no such a thing as a photo as it was inside the lens or outside the lens. Because there is always a level of manipulation,
Absolutely.
Okay.
Even your
The-
lens alone adds distortion
even the
to your
lens
image.
alone introduce the factor of the glass,
Yeah.
that's the thing. But the problem I'm having is that people, as you said, think that this is a manipulation, is an artifact, is something that is not real,
Inauthentic.
and non-authentic. The point I'm trying to make is that you said it's the true thing. I kind of lost myself now. For everybody to know.
We're hanging in there.
Maybe you have to say something and I think about it, but it will come back when it's too late. So now I don't know what to say because I lost what I was going to say.
There is no truth.
I was following your train of thought a little bit, but it used to be said that photography was going to replace painting, because once we had photography, we wouldn't have to worry about painting things. But it seems now that the ability to manipulate digitally in photography has essentially become painting.
Yeah.
And
It's up to you to make that decision, how far you want to go with it. I mean, the only thing that I would say is that I'd hope you'd be honest about your process.
I think a painter might argue.
well, that's true.
You can. I mean, you
Yeah.
can literally go into Photoshop.
Can make it look like a painting.
You can choose different brushes,
And you can
and you could make bad paintings.
So the reason to be honest about has something to do with authenticity or
For me, it does.
Okay.
For me, it does, right? As an artist that's calling themselves a photographer,
Yeah.
I want to represent the work to me that's photography,
Photography.
right? If it's not photography,
Yeah.
if I am going and using AI to add a deer into a scene that wasn't there, then that's no longer
Okay.
photography, that's digital art, right?
Yeah.
There's an aspect of it that's photography because I did work off of a photograph.
Yeah.
But now I've added in something, I didn't even add it, right? I just put words in and something generated it
I see.
for me. So I think digital art is beautiful and I think you can make some absolutely stunning things, but it shouldn't be represented as photography, in my mind.
I don't know if that's digital art because digital art is what considered totally created by the computer.
Yes and no.
The digital, yeah, that's the take of digital. It's digital. It's not photography.
I don't know if that's true. I think digital artists use photography quite often.
You can use, but the idea is that digital is something that is totally created in situ.
Okay, that could be your
Photography
area.
is something that, if you do a composite of two photos,
Yes.
that is a composite photo, it's not
Still
a
photography,
digital.
in my mind.
It's digitally manipulated, but it's a
Still
photo.
photos, yeah. And that's something that, in my mind, like I showed you 2 photos that I took to combine to make
That's a
one,
photography.
because I knew what photo I wanted to take, and I knew the limitations of my camera. So I had to make decisions there, and I'm perfectly fine with that. I will take several photos in an image to get the depth of field from back to front to get a sharp photo and combine those
It's
photos.
still photography.
It's still photography.
Yeah.
Has it
In my
changed-
mind.
Has it changed the way you take a photo when you're looking at
Yes.
this? Yeah.
Knowing post-processing, knowing what I wanna do, means that when I'm out in the field, I have to make a lot of decisions based off of that. And if I don't, then I don't have all the data that I want to make that happen. When I go out and shoot, I shoot in two different ways. I go out and I scout, or I hike, and I just shoot impulsively the things that capture my eye. But ultimately, what I end up doing for most of my portfolio shots is I'll revisit the same composition over and over again, fine tune it, get the weather conditions that I'm looking for, so I can go into the field kind of knowing exactly what it is that I want to do. Jeff?
I have a quick question, short answer is fine. I have Photoshop and Photoshop Beta. Beta is relatively new, and when I click on bridge, on a photo, raw, it comes out in Beta.
Okay.
Now, it's selecting Beta. What is the advantage of one over one? Beta has more AI, is my understanding, or?
No, so Photoshop Beta, all that means is that you're getting early releases of features that will become part of the main version of Photoshop.
Really?
Yeah, so you're essentially testing, you're testing.
You're the guinea pig for those changes.
And those features in Photoshop Beta are not they're not perfect, there's a lot of bugs in them, so they're learning by putting those features out early, and then they're gonna.
So should I be using that, or should I just bypass it and just use Photoshop?
Entirely up to you.
Yeah, but I didn't.
Depends how buggy it is.
Yeah.
If you're getting results you don't like, then don't use it, because it means it's very buggy.
I don't notice any difference.
Well, then it's pretty good, it's not that buggy, so then I would use it, because you're getting probably features that the prior version doesn't have, so why not use it?
There is a problem with the beta version of every program.
That's why it's a beta.
It's buggy.
That's why it's a beta.
That's what no, I'm telling you. The problem is that the beta usually has features that the regular program doesn't have yet.
Yes.
So if you save in beta, you may not be able to open that file on the regular platform.
Definitely a possibility.
That's possible.
It might not be backwards compatible.
So Jack, I
I
have a
don't really
question.
see
That means
much
it's
of a
not
difference,
backwards
but that's
compatible if it does that.
Jack, I have a question.
But most
Yes.
times they do cover that and make it backwards
You
compatible.
say you wanna be a purist,
No,
right?
yeah.
No, I don't want to
You're
be
pure-
purist.
Well, you wanna make the scene look natural.
But the
I do.
beta
You
is
come
not
home.
definition.
What I will tell you is I am
Yeah. No, I
very
agree
far
with you.
from a purist. I speak from that standpoint.
Right,
just
then I already
because
know the answer to this
I
question.
know there are purists probably in this room.
I know the answer to your
And I
question.
don't want them to be scared of
You
both
come
processes.
home, you got that waterfall picture.
Yes.
Damn it, there's a beer bottle in it.
Yep.
You take
I
it
will
out.
absolutely remove it.
Yeah, I would too.
I have no problem.
There you go.
I will remove man-made signs.
What
that
about a
have
dead
been
tree?
Stuck down.
Yeah, he removed a stick out of that one with the
Yeah.
bridge. There was the
I'll-
stick
I'll
going
remove
across
it.
that was removed.
I'll remove it down the
Okay.
branch if it's not a big part of my
Yeah, it was down
composition.
branch, you removed it.
I'll remove a trail marker. Those
I
things
move,
don't-
I
those
remove
things don't
power
bother me.
lines all the time.
Those things don't bother
Oh my
me.
god. I know people that like power lines. I'm not one of them.
No, there is an
Theo
explanation.
loves power lines. Theo from
Go ahead.
Sanders, yeah.
There are many post-processing programs. Is there one that you prefer over another?
I prefer the combination of Lightroom and Photoshop. That's just mostly because that's what I learned on, and that's mostly the most popular application. So if I go to look up information on something, I can find more wealth of information on it. So that's just the road that I went down. That doesn't mean that that's the right road. Like Sergio uses Infinity Photo for a lot of his post-processing. There's Luminar, there's all different kinds of post-processing. And really the bottom line is, if it has raw functionality, and most of the features are gonna be pretty identical at this point.
Does manipulation and post-processing mean the same thing to you?
Yes. Yeah, they do. I don't think manipulation means anything negative. It just depends on how you're manipulating. But yeah, you're altering a file. So any change that you make to anything is a manipulation of it, right? A JPEG coming out of your camera has been manipulated by your camera instead of you. Is that a bad thing or is that a good thing? I don't know. But that's what it is. That's how we've developed our camera technology to do its best work to capture what
Yeah,
the eye can
that's
see.
the point that people don't understand, that JPEG or whatever is already a manipulation of what the lens produces.
It's all a manipulation. The dynamic range of our eyes is so different from the dynamic range of our cameras. Even if we said that our eyes were reality, we all see differently, we interpret colors differently.
There's
So
another-
there's not really one pure thing.
There is another thing, that when we look at something, sometimes we don't see a lot of things.
Yeah, 100%. Our brains are wired to focus on the detail, on the things that we're looking at, and remove things like down branches and scattered leaves and all of that. And that's how we see it. So when we walk up to a location, we say, "Wow, that's an amazing view." And then when you take a picture of it, you're like, "Wow, look at all this junk. There's trees coming in from the side. There's this. There's that." That's the way our brains work.
It's
So
exactly the same thing. So when we see something, the eye produce the image on the retina, but the brain produce what we see
yep.
in reality.
Yeah.
So it's our images are manipulated by our own.
Yes.
brain.
100%.
I'm losing it, so I'm starting to see black and white.
Yes, I agree.
Beethoven was deaf, but